Well, thank you so much, Dr. Edwards. I'm very, very grateful for that wonderful, lengthy summation of just my track record, yes, my misspent youth in history. So we'll begin our talk this afternoon, and we'll move things along here. Okay, so to set the stage a little bit, this is where we are. Okay? We are at this interesting place in history, both in Britain and the United States. So some things that were happening across the pond. Where's my trusty laser pointer? Oh, all right, it may have failed me. And so we are at the Gilded Age. This is Edwardian England. Colonialism at its peak, its height. Queen Victoria dies. Edward VII succeeds her and sits upon the throne in England, and some very, very fascinating changes occur. To 1900, the first Pan-African Conference, and Coleridge Taylor was actually the youngest delegate at that conference. And what was happening, if you will, in the musical realm, this is also the time of Gilbert and Sullivan. Opera was popular at that time, operetta particularly, and this is also that time of the cult of the exotic. Gilbert and Sullivan are my best go-to examples for that. On this side of the Atlantic, we are in the Reconstruction years, post-Civil War. I'm referencing the Black Codes, Dawes Act, and the Dawes Commission, and these two have implication for Coleridge Taylor's music, and then it's not a particularly stellar time in our history. This is also that time of the Jim Crow laws, and separate but equal. And while Edwardian England has one monarch sitting on the throne, we have, if you will, a veritable parade of presidents in office. Interestingly, too, Coleridge Taylor actually met Theodore Roosevelt. He made 3 tours to the U.S. and was invited to the White House. Our musical genres at the time, it's an interesting mix. Ragtime, cakewalks, and minstrel shows were very, very popular. I know I'm a wee bit preaching to the choir in this room with respect to semiotics. When I set the presentation up, I was geared for a larger population that had perhaps not as much knowledge and information in the area. So what's important for us, how we delve into meaning making or embodied meaning in music through, yes, lyrics are the most obvious, but for instance, horn calls and if you will, appropriateness and how we make associations with music, and dance forms, and then connotations of sound. And this happens to be one of my favorites. J.S. Bach, if you will, quote, digitally signing all of his works with the 4 pitches, B flat, A, C, B natural. This is also my other favorite on his music. His initials in mirror image, and then the crown with 7 points. The 7 points are considered to designate the 7 pitches of the major scale. And then the other, the clefs in 1 pitch, which I think is absolutely marvelous. I wish I were that creative myself. A little background on Coleridge Taylor. If you're, again, I'm somewhat preaching to the choir. I like to think and ruminate on how the shape of music history might have been changed had he lived to his full expectancy. Wow, 37. And double pneumonia is what took him at such a young age. And two, during his final illness in a moment of fever, he remarked that he hoped his obituary would not refer to him as Creole. Our colleagues, musicians in New York, in one of those tours, let's see, was it 1901, 1904, and 1906 were his three visits to this country. Some of the hard-boiled colleagues of New York freelance musicians referred to him as the African Mahler. Gustav Mahler was on this side of the Atlantic, at the Met, goodness, for 10 years. And he ruled with an iron fist. And so it's an interesting connotation for Coleridge Taylor. Supreme talent, very well organized, and demanded excellence. And that's probably some of the reason that he earned that moniker as the African Mahler. Musically, he brooked with no nonsense. His training was really quite amazing for the time. He was, like Mozart, a child prodigy. He was reading music and playing at age 4, before he could read text. He matriculated to the Royal College of Music at the age of 15 as a violin major, a couple years on violin, and then he won scholarship for composition and continued on at RCM as a composition major, studying with Charles Villiers Stanford. When he graduated, how he, if you will, made his claim to fame, it's this first commission of Coleridge Taylor's, the Ballade in A minor for orchestra. This actually came to him, you and I would call it today as a referral by Edward Elgar. Mm-hmm. Elgar had been commissioned to write something for the festival and essentially didn't have time, but he knew of Coleridge Taylor, and Elgar was at the premiere of Hiawatha's Wedding Feast and made the referral. This young composer has a lot of talent. I would like to transfer my commission to him. And that was what really set his reputation. Interestingly, for the time, and we tend not to think about these types of things in the present, we're familiar with our own country's checkered past with respect to history, to segregation, to general bad behavior. Similar things were happening in the UK. We talk about colonialism. We talk about the new imperialism. It was not easy for Coleridge Taylor to make his way as a professional musician, either as a performer or conductor. So Edward Elgar passing that commission to him was really more than just, if you will, a single commission. It was very much an endorsement that set his career for him. And in that respect, throughout Coleridge Taylor's short career, he was very, very fortunate in having mentors and supporters that were just happened to be in the right place at the right time to move things along. So what you see in the balance of this slide is, if you will, the 411 on his career, the other things that he did besides composition and how he made his way as a conductor, as a professor, and then to his own tours and other activities. And then two, his personal mission, if you will, was to do for African and African American music what Brahms had accomplished with Hungarian music what Dvorak and Smetana had accomplished with music of Bohemian, Eastern European folk genres. And then two, in poetics and that marriage between text and music, great fascination with Longfellow, with Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and with Paul Laurence Dunbar. In these trips to this country, Coleridge Taylor met and collaborated with Dunbar on several works. He met members of the Fisk Jubilee Singers. He also met Dubois, Frederick Douglass, who, by the way, Frederick Douglass actually wrote the preface for the U.S. Edition of 24 Negro Melodies, which is, no, I'm sorry, Booker T. Washington. He had other interactions with Frederick Douglass. So this is what happens when you do it off the cuff. Okay. Coleridge Taylor, his family, 2 children that both went on to have successful careers. Yes, his oldest son, Hiawatha, who himself became a very, very well-known conductor, and then his daughter, Gwendolyn, and she actually, later on in her career, dropped the Gwendolyn and went by April Coleridge Taylor. If we have time, there's a wonderful YouTube interview with her shortly before her death about reminiscences of her father and what it was like growing up in their household. So for in interest of time, I have, if you will, cherry-picked elements from Coleridge Taylor's catalog, which is really quite extensive. So some of the selected. Hiawatha's Wedding Feast is really his most well-known piece. Probably after that comes the 24 Negro Melodies, and then I chose 2 others to highlight: The Stars, which come from 5 fairy ballads, and then When I Am Dead, My Dearest from 6 sorrow songs. I chose the Negro Melodies and the sorrow songs because they highlight Coleridge Taylor's use of both African melody and African American song, most notably Negro spiritual. Hiawatha's Wedding Feast. This is wonderful evidence of the multiculturalism in Coleridge Taylor's works. It's interesting, too, that Hiawatha's Wedding Feast is cantata, but it was not composed as, if you will, one flowing, seamless work. It came together piecemeal. And then some wonderful examples of music that contain semiotics. Got the 5 Southern love songs. Part of Coleridge Taylor's legacy with this music, African Romance, Dream Lovers, Toussaint, the 18th century liberator of Haiti. So the reference in Toussaint Overture, the Quadroon Girl from the choral ballads, the sorrow songs, the melodies. In all of these, Coleridge Taylor is preserving African American song forms, both Negro spiritual, Jubilee, plantation songs, work songs, and field hollers in his music. And then, because I'm doing a lot of talking and we've not done much listening. We'll pull up the Quadroon Girl. So we tend to discount a lot of Coleridge Taylor's music. Oh, it's simple, it's this, it's that, it's the other. The intersect of poetics and music are really, really quite wonderful. And some of the examples in terms of intervallic distances and the way that he uses them to illuminate text and convey meaning. So, for instance, that part, the slaver's hand is on the latch. He seems in haste to leave. The way he highlights that is absolutely wonderful. And then the next that's in the list is the stars, which so these are a little bit later in his musical output. So he's done some interesting things in this as well, using both, if you will, the Queen's English and then African-American dialect, what we would hear in spiritual. So for instance, mudder as opposed to mother, and if you will, dee, dem, does. So, wonderful. Also too, how he highlights text, the octave leap on love, and then the references to God, how he elongates to me. highlight meaning. Okay, the big stuff. Hiawatha's Wedding Feast. Okay. So, what you hear, Native American rhythmic patterns, okay, and the intervallic distances, da, da, dee, the beginning, and he manages to do a wonderful job of interpolating that with what you and I would expect from late 19th, early 20th century orchestral music. So we have the sweetness of the strings, we have the horn calls in the brass. It all comes together wonderfully well. And two, there's just a nice little flavor of, if you will, the Old West in terms of melodic shape. Now, to tell a little of the story on Hiawatha, get caught up here too. When Coleridge Taylor was writing this, yes indeed, the cult of the exotic was at its height, and the study of Amerindian culture was popular. Audience loved this stuff, probably much as we loved spaghetti westerns in the 1950s. And part of the agenda for Coleridge Taylor too was his desire to express his African identity. So spirituals, African-American thematic elements served as the bedrock, along with Native American elements for foundation for a lot of his later compositions. Okay. Two, this was he himself. If you read extensively in his biography, he was subject to discrimination and racial slurs, and so he had very strong feelings, I guess you would say, about being, if you will, a champion for the disenfranchised. And that was not at all what I intended to do. There we go. Let's try that instead. Okay. So I mentioned that Hiawatha was, it came together as three parts. As a result of the success of the wedding feast, He also set Minnehaha's death, and then Hiawatha's farewell, and then what came last was actually the overture to Hiawatha. So the cantata came together kind of piecemeal. And two, if we had time for the entire cantata, overall it created this wonderful set of themes of sociological influence. So we have a marriage feast. We have famine and sickness, Minnehaha's death. We have contact with European settlers leading to cultural annihilation. And then we have Hiawatha's death, which serves as that foundation in terms of a memory anchor and prospects for future social continuity. Two, if you listen carefully, tucked away in Hiawatha's wedding feast is the spiritual, the tune, "Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen." So the construction is very, very wonderful. And two, I think this one woman's opinion, part of what made it so successful at the time, not only the musical work itself, but if you will, just the pure exoticism of Longfellow's poem it was at that point in history when the significance of the struggle for cultural and racial equality was bubbling over. So, coming up in our slides are songs that I selected from the 24 Negro spirituals. Coleridge Taylor participated in that first Pan-African conference in London in July of 1900. And this was a huge gathering of African, Afro-Caribbean, and African-American individuals to debate this new imperialism, and they were also campaigning for black rights, something we don't tend to talk about until much later. W.E.B. Du Bois was present at the conference, and this was how Coleridge Taylor and Du Bois came to know one another. Interestingly, too, Samuel Coleridge Taylor called himself an Anglo-African and fought very diligently against race prejudice during his lifetime. So, what he does for us is this wonderful ability to incorporate black traditional music with concert music. Besides the 24 Negro melodies, we have the African suite, we have African romances, and then Hiawatha's wedding feast that incorporates both. So what I chose the Warrior Song, and I want to talk about a little bit about the organization of this, the Negro melodies. Okay, so we have 24 altogether. Okay. Actually, I'm going to play the first. It's the Warrior Song, and what he has done in the organization of these, he either puts, if we were talking chant, we'd say, okay, we've got an incipit here, yeah. But he has included, if you will, the reference point, whether it's a spiritual or West African melody or something else. And he's included that at the beginning. So, for instance, the Warrior's Dance is South African in origin. So here's if you will, our germ motive, and then how he introduces it in the music. credit where credit's due. The very, very talented African-American pianist Frances Walker is the artist for these. She was on the faculty at Oberlin, just an incredible woman. So, Coleridge-Taylor divided the set into Southeast Africa, South Africa, West Africa, the West Indies, and finally America. 16 break out into African American origin, either Negro American or taken from spiritual collections. Of the 8 remaining songs, 7 emanate from Africa and were inspired by the Swiss missionary Henry Alexander Junod's Le Chant et le Conte de Baranga de la Groda. And the last is a calypso-style African dance on bambula. You may be more familiar with Gottschalk's take on bambula. And that is West Indian musical motive. It's a very cool thing. Junot's book is divided into 2 parts. The first part of his book deals with songs of baranga and traditional African melodies. The second part deals with African stories, so storytelling. The role of the griot in African culture is absolutely central. So animal stories, fairy tales, morality tales comprise the second part of the book. Even though the African melodies are not drawn from Coleridge-Taylor's own Sierra Leonean background, the whole idea of creating the album was really forward-thinking. I suppose you might even say startling for the time. So remember, we're talking, Coleridge-Taylor started working on the project in 1903 and finished in 1905 when the work was published. So we have lots of scriptural allusions, we have some very unique interpretations of standard hymns, and we'll take a listen to part of the Bambula. And 2, Coleridge-Taylor, as a youngster, he eschewed the piano in favor of the violin, yet the talent, the complexity in his writing, it's just absolutely marvelous. All right, I also chose Deep River from the spiritual, well, from the songs. Negro melodies very much serve to promote intercultural understanding and also serve to make African musical elements at home on the concert stage. That was one of the wonderful accomplishments of Coleridge Taylor. Two, he was trying to, if you will, replicate the success with traditional African music that Brahms had had with Hungarian music. And two, in Bambula, you hear some of the same interesting, challenging harmonies that you hear in Brahms, that you hear in Chopin, that you hear in Liszt. And yeah, okay, I'll go Mahler too. Why not? In other words, so the late Romantics or post-Romantics that kind of strips away some of the froth of Edwardian era music. In other words, so it's a nice counterbalance to the salon orchestras in this country at the same time that were playing kind of syrupy, sweet string arrangements of ragtime. So he was very much, if you will, a fresh breeze blowing. Get rid of that. Okay. One more that I chose, pretty well, is Run, Mary, Run. And two, I chose this for the piano technique and the way that Coleridge Taylor chose to start this in the middle, so you can hear some of the changes in the harmonies. I love that chromatic passage right there, absolutely wonderful. So how he musically imitates running through chromaticism. One more song. So the references to Cypress Tree and the way he highlights those harmonically, the way he highlights death musically, some absolute wonderful examples of semiotics and music. Speaking of death, and yes, and Coleridge Taylor's short life, we don't tend to think about the impact that people have on our lives musically. Coleridge Taylor, not only in his native Britain, but on this side of the Atlantic, had such an impact on people. He was singularly admired by African Americans in this country to the extent that a 200-voice African American chorus was founded in Washington, D.C., and they called themselves the Samuel Taylor Coleridge Society. When Samuel Taylor Coleridge died in 1912, King George V granted an annual pension of £100 to his widow. That doesn't happen. That just doesn't happen. 24 West Africans, a delegation from Sierra Leone, attended his funeral, and they laid a wreath in the shape of the continent featuring Sierra Leone at his grave. Truly, he was a champion of indigenous peoples, and his music very much serves as a reflection of the new imperialism expressing African and by inference anti-imperialist views and sympathies. So the semiotics in his music compel us to focus upon the dignity of oppressed races and lead to a deeper understanding of the pain in Black history, forced migration, social disenfranchisement, death, Jim Crow laws, suppression of human rights. And all of these elements are central to his body of work. And it's my distinct privilege to have had the opportunity to share a little bit of Samuel Coleridge Taylor's music and his life with you this afternoon. Thank you so much for your kind attention.